μου, δεν κλείνεις λίγο το μικρόφωνο σου? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our annual Easter conference entitled Sacred Days in Early Medieval Christianity, the Case of Easter. It's that time of the year again, and we're all celebrating the Orthodox Easter properly. That's why we're having this conference. And I won't speak too much. I just want to thank all the organizers, Dr. Konstantinos Zorbas, Peter Konieczny, John J. Gallagher, and Hagit Sivan for helping us organize this event. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Zorbas to say his greeting. Dr. Zorbas?
Thank you very much, Zoe. I try to speak in Greek, if it is possible for the... Ευχαριστώ και συγχαίρω για αυτή τη νέα προσπάθεια, ιδιαίτερα τη κυρία Ζωή Τσιάμι και τους Μετιβιαλίστ, καθώς και τους εισηγητές. Το Πάσχα έχει ιδιαίτερη σημασία για μας τους Ορθοδόξους και ιδιαίτερα τους Έλληνες. Μάλιστα υπάρχει και ένα τραγούδι το οποίο λέγει «Πάσχα των Ελλήνων Πάσχα, Πάσχα της αγάπης Πάσχα, Πάσχα των Αγγέλων, ήλιος φωτοδότης των Ελλήνων Πάσχα». Βέβαια υπάρχουν και εκτός από τους ποιητές και πάρα πολλοί λογοτέχνες που ασχολήθηκαν με το θέμα αυτό και αναφέρομαι κυρίως στον Αλέξανδρο Παπαδιαμάντη με το πολύ γνωστό βιβλίο του «Λαμπριάτικος Ψάλτης», ο οποίος αναφέρεται σε ήθη και έθιμα της περιοχής της νήσου Σκιάθου κοντά στο Βόλο. Τα έθιμα του Πάσχα αποτελούν πράγματι μια μεγάλη και σημαντική κατηγορία εθήμων του ελληνικού λαού, όπου οι θρησκευτικές αναμνήσεις συναντούν τις ανοιξιάτικες τελετές. Η λέξη «έαρ» είναι αρχαία ελληνική, ενώ στη μεσαιωνική Ελλάδα χρησιμοποιείται η λέξη άνοιξης. Προέρχεται από το ρήμα ανοίγνημη, ανοίγω δηλαδή, διότι είναι η εποχή που ανοίγουν τα άνθη και τα μάτια των φυτών για να αναπτυχθούν. Η διαδοχή των εποχών και των εορτών γίνεται ένα ταξίδι, ένα προσκύνημα προς το Άγιο Πάσχα, το οποίο είναι το τέλος και ταυτόχρονα η αρχή. Είναι το τέλος όλων αυτών που αποτελούν τα παλαιά και η αρχή της νέας ζωής, μια συνεχής διάβαση από τον κόσμο αυτό στη Βασιλεία του Θεού που έχει αποκαλυφθεί εν Χριστώ, όπως γράφει ο μεγάλος Ρώσος θεολόγος Αλέξανδρος Μέμαν. Αλλά και η Σαρακοστή, στην οποία διανύουμε εμείς οι Ορθόδοξοι αυτή την περίοδο, δεν σημαίνει τίποτα άλλο παρά ένα μέτρημα του δρόμου που απομένει. Είναι και αυτή ένα ταξίδι. Υπάρχει βέβαια όχι επειδή οι μέρες είναι μαγικές ή ιερές σε σχέση με τις άλλες, αλλά υπάρχει χάριν του τέλους. Υπάρχει για να μοιηθούμε στην έννοια του οράματος του καινούριου που βρίσκεται στο τέρμα των 40 ημερών. Στη Μεγαλοβδομάδα δηλαδή και στο τέλος στην Ανάσταση. Και εδώ σημαίνει συμμετοχή στην ουράνια Αγία Τράπεζα και στο ατελείωτο δείπνο της Βασιλείας του Θεού. Σε αυτή την ευχαριστιακή σχέση, επαναλαμβάνω ευχαριστιακή σχέση και όχι σχέση κατανάλωσης, οφείλουμε να παλέψουμε με όλες μας τις δυνάμεις για την αλλαγή του κόσμου. Αλλαγή του κόσμου στην Ορθόδοξη Χριστιανική παράδοση σημαίνει απελευθέρωση του ανθρώπου από κάθε μορφή θανάτου, και κυριολεκτικά και μεταφορικά. Και φυσικά Ανάσταση σημαίνει η νίκη της ζωής. Εδώ θα πρέπει να μείνουμε λίγο και στο ήθος του ανθρώπου, ο οποίος υπογραμμίζει το πλαίσιο της ατομικής του ευθύνης και της ελευθερίας, και φυσικά δεν μπορούμε να τονίζουμε μόνο την έννοια της ελευθερίας, αλλά να επικεντρώνουμε την προσοχή μας και στις συνέπειες που απορρέουν από αυτήν την ελευθερία. Στοχεύουμε αυτή την περίοδο περισσότερο στις πράξεις μας που έχουν να κάνουν με την διατροφή. Και οι συνέπειες αυτής της μονόπλευρης προσέγγισης έχει δημιουργήσει φυσικά και τεράστιες ζημιές στο φυσικό περιβάλλον. Και αυτό το οποίο λένε οι ειδικοί, ο μόνος τρόπος αντιμετώπισης αυτής της περιβαλλοντικής κρίσης είναι η αλλαγή της νοοτροπίας και της συμπεριφοράς του ανθρώπου. Εάν δούμε τον τρόπο με τον οποίο προσεγγίζει ο Άγιος Γρηγόριος ο Θεολόγος σε ομιλία του στο Άγιο Πάσχα, έχει πολύ μεγάλο ενδιαφέρον να δούμε αυτό το οποίο εμείς επικεντρώνουμε, όπως είπα, και την ημέρα του Πάσχα στην διατροφή, στο τι θα φάμε δηλαδή, και καθ' όλη τη διάρκεια της Σαρακοστής, με το θέμα της νηστείας, αλλά εδώ ανατρέπει αυτή την κατάσταση ο Άγιος Γρηγόριος ο Θεολόγος. Γράφει σχετικά, ανοίγω εισαγωγικά, «Ας θυσιάσουμε όχι νοερά μοσχάρια, ούτε αρνιά, το μεγαλύτερο μέρος των οποίων είναι νεκρό και δεν αισθάνεται τίποτε. Αλλά ας προσφέρουμε στο Θεό ευχαριστήριο θυσία, στο ουράνιο θυσιαστήριο μαζί με τους χορούς των αγγέλων. Ας μιμηθούμε με τα πάθη μας το πάθος του Χριστού. Ας τιμήσουμε το αίμα του Χριστού με το αίμα μας και ας ανερχόμεθα με την προθυμία στο Σταυρό. Τα καρφιά είναι γλυκά, έστω και αν προκαλούν φοβερούς πόνους, διότι το να υποφέρει κανείς μαζί με τον Χριστό και χάρη του Χριστού είναι προτιμότερο από το να ζει ζωή απολαύσεων κοντά σε άλλους». Κλείνουν τα εισαγωγικά. Δεν θα κάνω ερμηνεία, τα σχόλια περιτεύουν σε αυτήν την πανέμορφη ομιλία που αξίζει κανείς να τη διαβάσει του Αγίου Γρηγορίου του Θεολόγου για το Άγιο Πάσχα. Δυστυχώς σήμερα που οι όροι και οι συνθήκες της ζωής έχουν ριζικά αλλάξει, το Πάσχα συνεχίζει να έχει για όλους μας την ίδια θρησκευτική, συναισθηματική, αλλά και οικογενειακή φυσικά αξία, καθώς κατά κανόνα συνδυάζεται με την πρόσκαιρη επιστροφή πολλών, ειδικά των Ελλήνων, στους τόπους καταγωγής τους. Εκεί μέσα στη λαμπρή και την ελληνική φύση αναδημιουργούμε τους δεσμούς με τον τόπο και τους ανθρώπους του για να δομούμε το σύστημα των αντιστάσεών μας, των πνευματικών αντιστάσεων, για να μπορέσουμε να συνεχίσουμε τη ζωή μας στις αστικές κοινωνίες. Με αυτήν την προβληματική θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ, επαναλαμβάνω, τη ζωή η οποία ετοιμάζει αυτές τις ιερές, θα έλεγε κανείς, ημέρες μέσα από τα συγκεκριμένα συνέδρια Χριστούγεννα και Πάσχα, και φυσικά για να γίνει η κατανόηση και να γνωρίσουμε, αν θέλετε, αυτήν την πραγματικότητα, σημαίνει έρευνα και μελέτη για τα τι και τα πώς. Και οφείλουμε ευχαριστίες σε όλους τους ερευνητές που ασχολούνται με τον πρώιμο χριστιανισμό και το μεσαιωνικό χριστιανισμό και μας μεταφέρουν στοιχεία τα οποία είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικά και τα οποία ίσως θα μπορούσαν να υιοθετηθούν ως ένα βαθμό στο σήμερα. Είτε πρόκειται για ήθη και έθιμα, τα οποία και αυτά έχουν αλλοιωθεί και κοσμικευθεί στις ημέρες μας, είτε, αν θέλετε, προτάσεις θεολογικού περιεχομένου για τον τρόπο αντιμετώπισης αυτών των μεγάλων εορτών που είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικές στη λειτουργική ζωή του κάθε χριστιανού και μάλιστα του χριστιανού στον 21ο αιώνα. Ευχαριστίες πολλές προς όλους και εύχομαι σε όλους και όλες καλή Ανάσταση. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, κύριε Ζορμπά. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I would like to invite the other two organizers, Professor Hagith Sivan and Dr. John Gallagher, to say a few words about this conference. Let's start with Professor Sivan.
That's it. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. This is the second year that we come together to discuss all the varieties and complexities of Easter. And I'm very pleased that you took the initiative to carry on with this conference. And I'm very grateful to all the wonderful people who contributed their ideas and proposals, and I'm really looking forward to listening to their presentations. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you too. Dr. Gallagher, would you like to say a few words? I think John is not with us now. Yeah, perhaps he can talk later. Okay, so let's move on to our first presentation for today. Researcher Ioanna Skoura, who will talk about Theodore Balsamon's text on Easter Computus. Ioanna, the floor is yours. Your microphone, please.
Okay, now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You can share your screen.
Where is it?
It's the green button down below.
Ah, what?
Let
Wait,
me just speak in
because
Greek.
something has interfered now. Oh,
Ιωάννα, είναι το πράσινο κουμπάκι κάτω-κάτω.
γιατί δεν το βρίσκω, ρε ζωούλα μου. Να ανοίξω view, κάτσε να το κάνω
Για κάνε πλήρη την οθόνη σου.
full screen.
Τελείως το παράθυρο.
Ναι. Εντάξει, τώρα ναι. Τώρα μια
Ωραία.
χαρά. Okay.
Άρχισε.
Okay. Share screen, έτσι.
Μμμ.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Let me
Sorry to
start.
interrupt, Ioanna, but could you give us a view of your PowerPoint?
Yes, Zoe.
Yes. Do you want me to show it?
I can't hear you, Zoe.
Ωραία. Να μιλήσω στα ελληνικά. Ιωάννα, με
Μμ.
ακούς?
Δεν σ' ακούω. Γιατί δεν σ' ακούω, μωρέ. Πω.
Τώρα?
Τώρα ναι.
Ωραία. Λοιπόν, πήγαινε στο PowerPoint σου και δείξτε το μας.
Το έχω ανοίξει.
Ναι, ναι, απλά εμείς δεν το βλέπουμε. Τώρα
Α,
το βλέπουμε.
τώρα
Ναι.
το βλέπετε.
Ναι.
Εντάξει. Okay. Λοιπόν, let me start by thanking the Orthodox Academy of Crete, the Medievalists Net and After Constantine Journal for selecting my paper and giving me the opportunity to speak about an unknown text on Easter Computus written by the 12th century canonist Theodore Balsamon. This text belongs to a specific kind of Byzantine literature aiming at satisfying a practical need, the determination of the movable date of Easter and other important dates in the liturgical year. Texts of this kind provide the knowledge required for the calculation of these dates in any given year. Judging from the quite large number of texts on Easter Computus that have come down to us, their composition was a common practice throughout the Byzantine millennium. Such texts were written principally by anonymous authors. Only a small number of them have been written by certain prominent Byzantine scholars, among which is Theodore Balsamon. His text on Easter Computus will be examined in this literary context. Theodore Balsamon, a high official of the Byzantine Church, is mainly known for his commentary on the so-called Nomocanon of 14 titles, which is a collection of canon law, and for his commentary on the canons of the Apostles, Synods, and Fathers. His text on Easter Computus is incorporated into his commentary on the canons of the Synod of Carthage held in 419. More specifically, Balsamon interpolated this text into his commentary on Canon 73, which decrees that the date of Easter should be announced on the day of the annual synod. Balsamon's commentary was edited in 1853 by Georgios Rallis and Mikhail Potlis in their Syntagma of the Divine and Sacred Canons. And it was also published in 1865 by Jacques-Paul Migne in Patrologia Graeca. But in Migne's edition, the canon has the number 76. Before passing to Balsamon's text, some preliminary notes are in order. According to the rules set by the Church Fathers, Easter should be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring, that is, after the full moon that occurs on or immediately after the day of the spring equinox, which was fixed on the 21st of March. Let us note here that the day of the first full moon of spring, or else the Paschal moon, was the day on which the Jewish Passover was celebrated, regardless of what day of the week it was. Consequently, for the Byzantines, after the Paschal moon meant after Passover. Easter should not be celebrated simultaneously with Jews. And as witnessed by a considerable number of our sources, the avoidance of simultaneous celebration with the Jews was an issue of main concern for the Byzantines. This correlation between the date of Easter and the date of Passover helped to formulate the traditional procedure that they followed for the determination of Easter in a given year. As a first step, they found the date of Passover, and as a second, the day of the week on which Passover fell. Based on these two data, they finally found Easter. Then, on the basis of Easter, they found the date of Mid-Fair Sunday. And it is this procedure that follows also Balsamon, whose text presents the methods for finding Passover, Easter, and Mid-Fair. Let us now examine his text. In terms of structure, the text comprises a prologue and the main part. In his prologue, Balsamon, after discussing about what the canon demands, explains that he was stimulated to write this text by the fact that neither from the canon in case nor from any other canon one can learn how to find the date of Easter. In the following, Balsamon states his purpose: to teach how one can find the date of Passover, of Easter, and of Mid-Fair, and enable in this way his reader to avoid celebrating Easter or starting the abstinence from meat on a wrong day, which, as he says, would be unpardonable. As we see, Balsamon, from the beginning of his text, underlines the importance of celebrating Easter on the proper day. Let us now see the main part of the text. In terms of structure, the main part comprises an introduction and 5 sections. Balsamon begins his introduction by saying, one must first and foremost know that if we don't know the day of Passover, we can't say when the Christian Easter should be celebrated. After this statement, Balsamon informs his reader about the limits of Passover and Easter. Passover could fall on any day in the interval from the 21st of March up to the 18th of April. As for Easter, its earliest date could be the 22nd of March and its latest the 25th of April. Let us now examine the 5 sections of the text. The first section is of preliminary character. Balsamon first presents the general method for finding the principal elements involved in the computation of Passover in whatever year. And these elements are the cycle of the moon and the cycle of the sun. After that, he presents the general method for finding the date of Passover in whatever year. These preliminaries having been set out, Balsamon proceeds to exemplify the methods by a worked example. He calculates the date of Passover for the year 6686 from the creation of the world, that is, for the year 1178 of the Christian era. He finds that in the given year, Passover fell on the 5th of April. Once the date of Passover has been found, Balsamon continues on to the second step of the procedure, finding the weekday of Passover. This section begins with a short introduction where Balsamon states that it is necessary to know on which day of the week Passover falls. He then presents the general method for finding the weekday of whatever date of Passover. And after that, he exemplifies the method for finding what day of the week is the 5th April on which Passover fell in the given year. Let me here underline that finding the weekday of Passover was of crucial importance for the Byzantines, because if Passover fell on a Sunday, then for avoiding the simultaneous celebration with the Jews, Easter should be postponed to the following Sunday. If Passover fell on any other day of the week, Easter should be celebrated on the Sunday coming immediately after the day of Passover. In any case, Easter should be celebrated after Passover. And this is explicitly stated by Balsamon in the introduction of the next section of his text, where he says that according to the ecclesiastical tradition, Easter should be celebrated after Passover. And since Passover fell on Wednesday, April 5, Easter should necessarily fall on April 9. Once the date of Easter has been found, the next step is to find the date of Mitfair on the basis of the date of Easter. Here, Balsamon first presents a general method for finding Mitfair in whatever year. After that, he presents an alternative and easier, as he says, method, serving the same purpose as the previous one, and he applies it for finding when Mitfair falls. In the given year, Mitfair fell on the 12th of February. Let us note here that in the calculation of Mitfair and of the weekday of Passover in a given year, one should take into account the fact that this year might be bisextile. In relation to this matter, Balsamon gives at the end of his text some explanations about the bisextile year. Let us now recapitulate the results found by Balsamon. For the year 6686 from the creation of the world, date of Passover was 5 April. Weekday of Passover, Wednesday. Date of Easter, 9 April. Date of Mitfair, Sunday, 12 February. One might wonder whether these dates are correct. If we trust our sources, we can ascertain that they are correct. Let us examine, for example, the Paschalion found in the 12th century Eucologion. We can see that these are the dates written for the year in question. Or, to give one more example, the Paschalion found in the 12th century Psalter, where we also see these same dates. We could therefore say that following Balsamon's instructions, one could find the correct dates of Easter at Mitfair Sunday. And as already seen, The celebration on the proper dates was underlined by Balsamon in his prologue. Proper date of Easter means after Passover, and this was also underlined by Balsamon when he explicitly stated that Easter should be celebrated after Passover. This statement, in its turn, echoes the one that Balsamon makes elsewhere, specifically in his commentary on the Seventh Apostolic Canon, where he states, "The divine apostles do not wish that we celebrate simultaneously with the Jews." Up to now, we have seen that Balsamon offers his reader the knowledge required for finding the correct dates of Easter and Mid-Fair. It is worth mentioning here that Balsamon's commentary on the canons of Carthage is transmitted alongside the corresponding commentaries of the 12th century canonists Alexios Aristinos and Ioannis Zonaras. And let me note that neither Aristinos nor Zonaras treat this important issue in their commentaries. Let me also add that Balsamon's text on Easter Computus did not pass unnoticed. We see, for example, in this 14th century manuscript, which transmits Balsamon's commentary, that his text on Easter Computus is twice marked as significant by marginal notes. Here, you see here, I magnified, we see the usual note σημείωσε, and next to it is written, how one should find the Christian Easter. On the next folio of the same manuscript, at the top margin here, we read, note the interpretation of the present canon because it teaches how and from what data one can say in advance which is the day of Mid-Fair, of the legal Easter, and of the Christian Easter. Let us now come back to the traditional procedure for finding Easter, which, as we saw, is also followed by Balsamon. One might wonder whether the date of Easter could be found independently of the date of Passover. The fact is that there was an alternative procedure which did not require finding first Passover. Easter could be found on the basis of Mid-Fair. To the best of our current knowledge, this procedure is witnessed in only one manuscript before Balsamon's time. And as it results from our sources, it started gaining some degree of popularity after the second quarter of the 14th century. The most known witness to the use of this procedure is the text on Easter Computus, written in 1335 by the canonist Mattheos Vlastaris and incorporated in his Syntagma, in his canonical collection known as Syntagma. After first following the traditional procedure for finding the dates of Easter and Mid-Fair in the year 1335, Vlastaris explains how one could first find Mid-Fair and then find Easter on the basis of Mid-Fair. But he presents this procedure as an alternative one for finding Easter, or else in this way. And the fact is, as witnessed by our sources, that this procedure was presented only as the alternative that could be followed for finding Easter. In no way it superseded the traditional procedure, which remained predominant until the end of the Byzantine millennium and continuing to be predominantly followed for centuries afterwards. To conclude, Balsamon, through his text on Easter Computus, made accessible a knowledge of special importance for the Byzantines. His goal was to teach the reader how to find the correct dates of Easter and Mid-Fair Sunday in whatever year. If we had to assess the didactic value of Balsamon's text, we could say that it serves its purpose well. It offers a cohesive group of instructions enabling the reader learning how to find the sought-after dates. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you too, Dr. Skura, for this wonderful presentation, which led into some new evidence to be appeared here. You can stop sharing your screen now.
Okay.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Let us move on to Dr. Susan Eddington, which is going to present us the failure of charters and the failure of the Easter fire in 1101.
Thank you. I'll just try and share my screen.
Yes.
Right, hope you can see that.
Yes, yes, we can.
Well, thank you for inviting me or accepting my offer to contribute here. I'm going to talk about another 12th century series of texts, in fact, and this is a political catastrophe that happened in 1101, which is the failure of the Easter fire. I hope that many of you, at least, are familiar with the miracle of the Easter fire, which takes place annually, still today, on Holy Saturday, the day before Easter. Crowds gather in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to witness the spontaneous kindling of a lamp inside the edicule, the little building that houses the tomb of Christ. There's been some research into the origin of the ceremony, which may have originated in the Carolingian West. It was witnessed by a Frankish pilgrim in 868. So it goes back at least to the 9th century, possibly further. During the Muslim occupation of Jerusalem, the miracle continued to take place annually under the supervision of Greek and Armenian clerics. And then, and this is my own field of research, the Franks captured Jerusalem in July 1099, and the miracle took place as before in the first Easter after that in 1100. However, the following year, the fire failed to arrive on Holy Saturday, finally only arriving on Easter Sunday itself. The key character whose report I've been researching is called Fulcher of Chartres. He was himself a participant in the First Crusade. He went, when it left Europe in 1096, Western Europe in 1096, he traveled with the main crusading armies and then accompanied Baldwin of Boulogne to Edessa, where Baldwin ruled as count from 1097 to 1100. When Baldwin became king of Jerusalem in 1100, Fulcher went there with him as his chaplain. He wrote a history of the First Crusade and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, covering the whole history of the Crusade, 1095 to 1099, and then of Baldwin's reign, 1100 to 1118, and his successor was Baldwin II. They're very unoriginal about names in the Middle Ages. His history is particularly important for the first decade of the 12th century, when there is no other written account by a resident of Jerusalem, somebody who was actually a witness to events. He completed the work in stages. The first was sent to Western Europe in 1106, and it contained a description of the Easter fire ritual as it happened in 1101. However, when he revised what he had written in 1127, he covered it in one sentence only. After the Eastern ceremony had been carried out, when everyone was perturbed because we did not have the fire on Holy Saturday at the Lord's Sepulchre, the king set out for Jaffa. Very matter of fact. How do we know what he wrote in 1106? Unfortunately, we have no copy of the manuscript that he sent to Northern Europe. What we do have is an abridgment and, in some cases, a paraphrase with some additional bits by an anonymous author. I'm going to refer to it as GFIE because Gesta Francorum Jerusalem Expugnantium, which means the deeds of the Franks who conquered Jerusalem, is just too much of a mouthful. This anonymous author said that he was using a copy of Fulcher of Chartres history. Guy Barrève-Nogent, who's quite well known as an author of a chronicle of the Crusade and the succeeding period, he wrote his Deeds of God through the Franks, Gesta, around 1108, and he didn't abridge the chronicle as the anonymous author did, but he added comments on him, often critical comments, and he named Fulcher as a rather rough and ready sort of author. We have the account of another eyewitness to the ceremony in 1101, an Italian civil servant, one of the very few secular authors who wrote about the Crusades and the Latin East, Caffaro of Genoa. He was there. Eckhard of Aura was in Jerusalem. He wasn't at the ceremony, but he spoke to a hermit who lived on the Mount of Olives, who relayed a first-hand account of his attendance at the ceremony in 1101. And thirdly, a view from a bit of distance, Matthew of Edessa. He reported how the Armenians reacted to the failure of the fire, which we will come to later. Interestingly, he also reported that in 1102, and it was interesting that Dr. Scourer was talking about the Orthodox and Latin dating of Easter. They differed in 1102, and Matthew says that it was the Franks fraudulently lit the holy fire on Palm Sunday. So interestingly, the actors in this event, I just want to run through the main characters because, as I say, it's a political failure rather than a religious failure. In fact, Godfrey of Bouillon became king of Jerusalem 1099, although he famously refused to wear a golden crown in the city where Jesus had worn a crown of thorns. And that's significant because when his brother Baldwin succeeded him as king in 1100, he was crowned by the patriarch, not in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem, choosing Christmas Day 1100 as the date for various historical purposes. It's quite a common date to be crowned king, not that being king is common, but for instance, Charlemagne was crowned on Christmas Day. William I of Normandy and England was crowned on Christmas Day. And I think Napoleon Bonaparte was too. So this Patriarch Dibert He was Patriarch of Jerusalem 1099 to 1102. And he was opposed to Baldwin's accession in 1100. There are theories that he wanted Jerusalem to become an ecclesiastical state and that he did not want a strong secular ruler, as Baldwin did in fact turn out to be. When Dibert became patriarch, Arnulf of Schalk, a Flemish priest, he was made, who had been made patriarch as an interim measure. He was provisional patriarch until the Pope could be consulted in July 1099. And then, of course, he was deposed or replaced in the December of the same year. And he was made Archdeacon of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He was later to become Patriarch of Jerusalem again in 1112. And he was a very staunch supporter of Baldwin I. And then we have Fulcher. We've met him already. He's another loyalist. He was very pro-Baldwin. He was his chaplain, and he chronicled the events. So this is the famous failure. The longest account is written by Fulcher himself. He writes, Ego Fulcherus, I, Fulcher. And he was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Although he omitted it later from the historian, it survived as abridged and converted to a third-person account in the GFIE, and that's an account of about 1,200 words in Latin. There's also a manuscript surviving, which is in Cambridge. It's sometimes referred to as Codex L, for reasons you don't need to know. That's about 1,400 words. And a very similar account that appeared in the first printed edition of Robert the Monk's History in Cologne around 1470, and again about 1,400 words. Guibert Nogent had also read it, but he somehow confused the chronology and commented on it twice, in 1101 and 1102, perhaps reflecting the confusion that Matthew reported. Apart from that small detail, there's broad agreement among these versions. So I just want to draw attention to the main points. Fulcher writes in a very personal and immediate way. He was impressed by the strangeness of the chants. He emphasizes that there were Greeks and Latins alternating in the performance of the office and translating each other's chants. When the fire did finally arrive on Easter morning, he participated in sharing it, and he describes how people were lighting candles and lighting each other's candles. As a member of the royal entourage, he has more about the king's activities. The king was nearby in the temple, on the Temple Mount, and which was a palace at the time, and he processed to the service. The author of the Gesta Francorum Jerusalem Expurgantium distanced himself from Fulcher's subjective account. He always converts to the third person. He doesn't like to pretend that he was there, as it were. But like Fulcher, he commented on the leading role of the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Syrians, and he also reported the clergy's attempted explanation for the failure of the fire. They said perhaps it was because the city, now that it was in Christian hands, did not need the miracle, because they had needed it. It was absolutely life-saving when the Christians were being persecuted by their Muslim rulers, and they would be put to death if the fire failed. Very significantly, and it's interesting that this is in his account, but not in the Fulcher first-person one, he included a long sermon by Patriarch Divert, delivered towards sunset on the Saturday, and Divert confessed his many crimes. He had almost certainly embezzled money, which was sent to the church. It's a long story, which Albert of Aachen covers in detail, but I don't need to go into now. But his opposition to Baldwin is important. Both versions of Fulcher's experiential account make the point that the king wore the trappings of royalty, not just within the city of Jerusalem, but even in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In short, he was crowned in Jerusalem. He wore a crown in Jerusalem. Other accounts largely back up what Fulcher reported in this longer account. Caffarot's is more coherent, even though it's much shorter. He says that the Patriarch's sermon was on Easter morning, not on Holy Saturday, and that the tenor of it was that the congregation shouldn't be downhearted because God worked miracles for the sake of unbelievers, and now that Jerusalem was in the hands of believers, the holy fire miracle was unnecessary. Eckhart heard about the failure from a priest named Herman, who lived on the Mount of Olives. Herman attributed the failure of the fire to the congregation's sins, and he contrasted it with the miracle's unfailing reliability during the period of Muslim rule. An additional detail he offered was that the Syrian Christians held their mass, as they customarily did, after the other groups had left the church. Matthew of Edessa described the failure succinctly. The lamp that usually burnt over the Holy Sepulchre would not burn on Holy Saturday, and was lighted only at the 9th hour of Easter Sunday. He ascribed the disaster wholly to the sins of the Frankish Christians, and the worst of those was being allowed to allow women to serve in churches in Jerusalem. Their prayers were heard only when this wrong was righted. The sequence of events was of great importance politically in the reign of Baldwin I, and particularly in his ongoing feud with Patriarch Divert. Divert had been appointed by Baldwin's predecessor Godfrey, very largely because Divert controlled a fleet of Italian ships, which was much needed for the conquest of the coastal towns. When Divert was appointed, Arnulf of Scholt's interim appointment was terminated, and he was appointed Archdeacon of the Holy Sepulchre. And now we come to the key bit, which is that this position gave him authority over the church's Latin canons and what happened there on Holy Saturday. He was King Baldwin's staunchest ally, and he was in a position to stage manage the non-appearance of the Holy Fire and to ensure that it occurred only after Patriarch Divert had abased himself and admitted his sins and shortcomings. Thereafter, the focus was on King Baldwin, who appeared in the church wearing the crown and the trappings of royalty. This marked his victory in the power struggle with Divert, and it was only a matter of time before Divert was deposed and replaced by another Baldwin loyalist, Evremar of Schalk, who was somebody known to Arnulf. Divert, in fact, went to Rome to plead his case, but he died on the way back to the Holy Land. So why did Fulcher Chartres later omit his vivid account that he wrote at the time? We can only speculate or conjecture. There are two possible reasons, I think. He was writing after Baldwin's death in 1118, which is the same year, in fact, that Arnulf died. He actually survived Baldwin by only a month. By then, the contest for precedence between church and state had been definitively won by the Jerusalem monarchy, now represented by Baldwin II, and so perhaps Fulcher considered the crisis was now irrelevant. Fulcher had become aware, perhaps informed by King Baldwin or Patriarch Arnulf, that the appearance of the Holy Fire had been manipulated in 1101, and he felt unable to recopy his naively enthusiastic description into his 1124 revision of the Historia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eddington, for this wonderful presentation. Let me just inform our audience that you can post your questions or comments as a comment on the YouTube section. So let's move on to any questions or notes. Does anybody from the group have to say anything?
Oh,
Yes, Hagith?
okay. Well, thank you so much for two really fascinating presentations. I'm particularly intrigued by the failure of the Holy Fire because I did attend one such event, but not a failure. I attended the appearance of the Holy Fire, and all I remember is that it was just so incredibly crowded that I actually fainted. But the nice thing is that even when you faint, you cannot really fall because there's just so many people around you. So I was dragged out to one of the courtyards and resuscitated. So that was my little miracle on that Easter. I have questions for you and certainly questions for the other for the Balsamon. So about the Fulcher of Chartres, it really is a wonderful detective work. To find out, in a sense, who's guilty. What I find fascinating is the explanations, the various and contradicting explanations for the failure. I would love to hear more about these very strange, such as the presence of women, or for that matter, the lack of necessity of the miracle at all. I mean, how did it actually merge in contemporary context, the larger context? And then the Theodor Balsamon, first of all, thank you so much for a very clear explanation of a very complicated subject that I've actually never been able to really fully understand. I'm intrigued, one, by the jump between the Council of Carthage in 419 to essentially centuries forward to Balsamon. I mean, what is it that connects between the two, besides his familiarity with the text? And the other thing is that since there have been calculations and speculations about the date of Easter for centuries before Balsamon, how does his explanation, which obviously proved to be very important, how does it actually fit into the history of these very long speculations? In other words, what was his distinct contribution to this ongoing discussion, and why did his version obviously want the upper hand? I find it wonderfully simple according to your presentation, but I imagine that there were other rival explanations of how to count Easter and the relationship between Easter and Passover. So thank you.
Okay. My personal opinion is that Balsamon wanted to be a little different, to make, let us say, to be, to bring something new in these commentaries, because neither Aristinos, neither Zonaras did deal with this subject, which is was of great importance to the Byzantines because they wanted to know in advance. There were the Paschalia where one could see for some years when Easter is, but if somebody wanted to know in advance, so one had to know, to have the special knowledge required for this. So Balsamon, in an innovative way, I could say, because in the middle of his commentary, he presents this text on Easter Completus. There are many texts, but anonymous. Balsamon, in this century, before Balsamon, we have Michael Psellos, also a text on Easter Completus attributed to Psellos, and we have many centuries ago one text attributed to the Emperor Heraclius, another text attributed to George Presbyter, and after Balsamon, in the 14th century, we have more texts on Easter Completus by eponymous authors. So your first question was, I can't...
the connection, why did he connect with the... why and how did he connect with the Council of Carthage in 42? Because I'm interested in North Africa in late antiquities. I'm curious.
Yes, because if you remember, these canons decrees when the date of Easter should be announced and nothing more. And Balsamon says, hence this canon or no canon, any canon does not say how we can compute the Easter day, how we could find the date of Easter. And because this canon says the Easter, the day of when Easter will be celebrated should be announced on the same day of the synod. So he grasped the opportunity to present this text, and his movement is really innovative because Zonaras cared about Easter in the sense that he had commented a little on the spring equinox, because it is not fixed actually, it's the ecclesiastical equinox. But Balsamon is the only one from the three great canonists of 12th century who wrote a text on Easter Completus, who was very, very useful for many reasons.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Yes. Susan, would you like to say something about your detective work?
I think, can I share screen again? I got another couple of slides. I cut it a little bit short, only because I realized I was out of time. I didn't want to go on any longer than right. We need to go right down. As to these different explanations, they were desperate to think of a good reason for it failing, and I think they were just justifications or excuses for the failure. The relief when the fire actually came was enormous. They were just and it's interesting that we have no other report of the fire failing to appear during the Latin period, at least, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. We have a very good description of the ceremony that the Russian abbot Daniel witnessed it in 1107. Albert of Aachen described the miracle in 1119. A Latin liturgy for the occasion was developed in the 12th century from the Greek form. And Latin participation persisted even after Saladin had recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, until 1238, when Pope Gregory IX condemned it as fraudulent, about which I have nothing to say. However, the Eastern churches continue to celebrate the miracle to the present day. And it seems from its persistence, if you like, all the time for another 9 centuries, that the disruption to the ceremonial in 1101 did more to reinforce belief in the miracle rather than undermining it. And you said that you'd actually attended it. I have a friend who lives in Jerusalem who also disguised herself and attended it. This is, as it was said, the edicule where the holy fire is lit is in the middle there, and it's surrounded by people desperate for, and you can just see the pinpoints of light. We don't know what's going to happen this year. That's the other thing I wanted to say, because the Orthodox Easter, I believe, is not quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Palestinian Christians have been barred. They have to apply for permission and they're not allowed to attend this year. And of course, pilgrims will be dissuaded, I think, from attending. So I suspect it will not be this sort of site.
Do we know, by the way, about the origins of the Easter fire? I thought it's older than what you mentioned. I didn't realize it's relatively late, or relatively speaking.
The first written account we have it is by a pilgrim who wrote in 868. His name was Bernard. He was a Frank, but that's not to say he wrote of it as an established practice. So it wasn't first, it could go back much, much further, but we don't hear about it in any of the, and we only have 3 or 4 earlier accounts of pilgrims to Jerusalem in Latin. I'm afraid I'm not so good, but I don't think we have anything in Greek either, which is what you would expect, or possibly Armenian. But anyway, so we can't prove that it's older than 9th century, but it could be. Andrew Jutishki has written on this subject, and he reckons that it was a practice that was taken to the east by in Carolingian times. But it's theoretical. It's
Yes. Oh, thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Any other questions? No, okay. We're going to take a short break, about 10 minutes, and then we'll be back. Dr. Gallagher will continue his presentation of the conference. So see you all in 10 minutes.
Can we have some coffee?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
See?
Thank you.
And maybe a little bit of beautiful Greek little delights.
Yes, of course.
Well, thank you. Okay. I think I'll just go to my own fridge.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a second. Right. Okay, just a second. Oops. Just a second. See. Mhm.
Is Susan still here, or I had a question that I didn't get a chance to ask during the session.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, hello. I was just wondering about this Easter fire. Are there kind of modern accounts of this still occurring in terms of the kind of spontaneous lighting up of candles at the start of the Easter Vigil liturgy?
Well, it still takes place. So yes, there are all sorts of. I mean, it's widely believed to be fraudulent. In short, I am not going to commit on that. It's a miracle.
Mhm.
If people want to believe it's a miracle, it's a miracle. But Jay Rubenstein has written at some length about it, and explained how it could be done in medieval times rather than now when
Yeah.
cigarette lighters seem to come into the play.
Mhm.
um, I'm less interested in that, I have to admit, than, as I say, the sort of this political event. I've written a biography of Baldwin the First, and I have in mind, I think, a novel with Arnulf
Ah,
as chief protagonist will be my next
brilliant.
project.
I'm a big fan of those S.J. Paris novels, the Fra Giordano Bruno.
Oh
Uh,
yes.
they're as far as historical fiction goes. So something in a similar vein would be very welcome, I think.
No, I mean seriously. Yes, there are plenty of modern experiences, but I think, like what Sivan said, it's people experience it as a phenomenon
Yeah,
without necessarily being Christian believers.
yeah.
Mm. But I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon.
Mhm.
Uh, and interestingly, Guy Rev Nogent, who is often very dismissive of miracles, relics, and so on, he believes in it.
Yeah.
So, yes.
It reminds me of the march down the Mount of Olives, because I joined the march, and I was walking with a very interesting Norwegian scholar who masters incredible number of languages. And he said to me, "Let me talk to a nun walked in front of us." And he said, "Let me talk to her and ask her a few questions about the ceremony." And he tried Russian and he tried whatever other languages. And finally she says, you can speak English. I'm Australian. I
Yes.
always thought that shows the lovely aspect of Jerusalem when it truly is colorful in more ways than one. At least it was colorful in more ways than one.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, the other interesting event is the Adventus on Palm Sunday,
Mhm.
when, as you say, the procession comes in from the Golden Gate. And in 1118, following his death in Egypt, Baldwin the First is strapped onto his horse so the Egyptians won't know that he's dead, in effect.
Oh, fascinating.
A bit like El Cid, if you
Mhm.
if you remember the film. And so they bring him back, and they time it very deliberately in order to coincide with the Passover, with the Palm Sunday Adventus, so that he actually enters. And there's this description of how the crowds of people who were gathered there to rejoice realize that this is the corpse of Baldwin, and it all turns to desolation again.
Amazing.
Wonderful stories.
Yes.
Well, I hope we're all suitably refreshed and that you've gotten a cup of coffee or water to continue with this next part of the conference. Do we have all of our speakers here? Chiro, Dr. Um, are we all back at the moment? I can see people are still in the participant list, but are we all here?
Mhm.
I think we're good to go.
Okay, brilliant. Well, the first speaker in our next panel which incidentally, we don't really have kind of themes for these panels, but if we did, I think the theme for this forthcoming panel would be something like time, liturgy, the liturgical calendar. The papers speak in various ways to these broader themes. The first speaker in this session now is Dr. Ciro Parado, who joins us today from the University of Cagliari in beautiful Sardinia, where I believe he's affiliated with the Department of Humanities, archaeologist by training, but works and teaches with the Humanities Division. And Dr. Parado, if you're ready to present,
Yes.
you're welcome to share your screen. Dr.
Yes,
Parado's paper today is entitled At Eternity's Gate, Iconology of Sacred and Profane Time Images in Christian Mosaics of the Months. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting conference. One moment, please. I show my presentation. Okay, did you see? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect, perfect. The aim of this presentation is the analysis of the cultural dynamics and the artistic language that have characterized their use of the iconographic patterns of the pagan months images in the Christian illustrated calendars, especially in the Near East from the second half of 5th century to the first half of the 7th century AD. The Roman and early Byzantine figurative calendars were widespread prevalently in Italy, North Africa, Greece, and Arabia from the 2nd to the 6th century AD. Their main medium was the floor mosaic and, to a lesser extent, stone relief, wall painting, glass, and the manuscript. Their iconographic subject matter, which concerned the representation of the 12 months of the year, symbolized the eternal secularity of the time and was based on the repertoire divided into 3 themes: the astrological, the festive, and the rural ones. Regarding the first type, chronological, concentrating during the reigns of the Antonine emperors, the months are depicted through images of the signs of the zodiac, often associated with those of its guardian deities, like the so-called altar of the 12 gods from Gabi in Italy. The second one included the personifications of the months that referred to the most important civic festivities, like the celebration of imperators' birthdays and the circus games, or the most popular dates of the temple's dedication and the religious feasts. One of the best known festival calendar is the Mosaic of the Months from Tisr in Tunisia, made in the first half of the 3rd century AD. This is the period when this type of calendar mosaic started to be used, while its diffusion ended about a century later, simultaneously to the affirmation of the Christian religion. Finally, the third theme consisted of the representation of the months, which allude to the main seasonal agricultural activities, particularly the pastoralism, the sowing, the reaping, and the grape harvest. The rural calendars, such as the one coming from the Saint-Romain-en-Galles in France, began at the same time of the great success of the so-called latifundia cycle and continued beyond the Middle Ages. During the first chronological phase of the realization of the illustrated calendars from the 2nd to the 5th century AD, they were concentrated mainly in Rome and Carthage, the capital of the empire and its second most important city, where they adorned prevalently the rich houses of the upper class members, since they wanted to express the power of the aristocracy. According to the hierarchical organization of the domestic space, the figurative calendars ornamented primarily the oeci and the triclinia, like in the case of the calendar mosaic of the so-called Villa of Falconer in Greece, because these rooms were used by the aristocrats to build profitably social relationship with their peers and to self-celebrate visually their high-class status through their floor mosaic decoration. This ideological function of the iconography of the months was based on the concept of eternity, inspired by the imperial authority, which backdates to the age of Augustus, when the princeps had used the epigraphic calendars as a means of propaganda, adding to the traditional festivals other new ones regarding his government activity in order to legitimize politically Israel, presented as the beginning of the new Aurea Aetas, the Golden Age. Augustus used another means of visual and verbal rhetoric, specifically the image of his zodiac sign, Capricorn, and the Virgilian and bucolic poetry, to strengthen this idea. Two illustrated calendars reflected very well this phenomenon. The painted fresco of Mons, now destroyed, which adorned the western apse of the Temple of Hercules in Sabrata in Libya, and the frieze of Mons, which decorated the central fornix of the triumphal arch of Port de Mars in Rome. The fresco, with its zodiac cycle of the astrological mages of the months, surrounded the shine of the apotheosis of Marco Aurelius and evoked the eternal power of the emperor, become a god and ascended to the stars. The frieze of the Port de Mars, erected to commemorate the Marcus Aurelius triumph over the Sarmatians and the Germans, during the 2nd century AD, was a rural calendar that, through its measure of annus and the season in the center, suggested the infinite prosperity of the Roman Empire. The same ideological dynamics influenced the aristocrats when they commissioned the illustrated calendars, in particular the rural ones which ornamented their urban houses and the country estates. They used the image of the months to express the idea of the endless abundance, especially through the Anti-Shins, a traditional symbol of heroic virtudes and royal power. One of the best examples of this cultural phenomenon is the calendar mosaic of the so-called Villa of Falconer in Argo, where its unknown owner self-represented himself while he was hunting with a hawk, a typical elite activity of the late antiquity aristocracy, surrounded by the personification of the mouse. The Christian illustrated calendars, which decorated the churches and other religion buildings, were commissioned by the members of the upper class, who have inherited the artistic language and partially the cultural values of the pagan aristocracy. The months were personified as human figures who performed rural activities or held seasonal attributes. These calendar mosaics were concentrated in the ancient Oriental provinces of Greece, Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, and Arabia from the 5th to the 7th century. But nowadays, only 13 calendar mosaics exist, although just a few artifacts are well preserved to the iconographic crisis. Most of these calendars came from Jerash in Jordan, one of the important city of the Decapolis, in particular during the episcopate of Paul in the first half of the 6th century, when many churches were built during the so-called Justinian Renaissance, the first phase of the Justinian reigns, when the political and economical wealth was strengthened thanks to the conquest of the ancient Western provinces, and the arts and the literature of the classical tradition were greatly developed. The patrons of these illustrated calendars are mentioned in the dedicatory inscription of the holy buildings were religious and the likes members of elite class, like in the first case the bishop Tirsos of the namesake basilica in Tegea in Greece, and in the second one Theodore, the wealthiest patron of the month's mosaic of the St. John the Baptist Church in Jerash in Jordan. The status of these patrons was confirmed by their superior cultural level, as demonstrated by the dedicatory inscription of Tirsos and Theodore written in meter, according to a typical use of the pagan literature by the Christian high clergy, like the Greek bishops Peter of the Basilica C in Anchialos in Greece, Domitius of Basilica Alpha in Nicopolis, and Paul of Apamea Cathedral, who use Homeric quotes and verses of the Euripides Hecuba in their dedicatory inscription. Furthermore, like the members of pagan or aristocracy, also those of the Christian upper class, like hunting, as demonstrated by the Cinegetica, one of the most important late antique treatises written by Synesius, bishop of Ptolemais. Numerous hunting scenes appeared in association with the calendar mosaics, such as the month's mosaic of Demetrius and Epiphanes in Thebes in Greece. In the Christian context, these images symbolize the triumph of godness of passion over passions and evil forces, or the dominion of the animal created by God to serve the mankind. As written by Philo of Alexandria in his treatise on the creation, and by John Chrysostom in his 8 sermons of the Genesis. Many other pagan iconographic themes accompany the Christian illustrated calendars, but with a different meaning concerning the new religion. The pastoral and grape harvest scenes represented into the inhabited wine scrolls of the cathedral mosaic of the St. Christoph Church in Cabrerama alluded to the biblical quotes about the community of the faithful under the Christ's guide. For instance, the words of Psalm 23:1, "The Lord is my shepherd." Those in the Gospel of John 15:1, "I am the true vine," referring to Jesus himself, and those of Isaiah 5:1, "A vineyard has been made beloved on a hilltop in a fertile place," referring to vine as a metaphor of the people of God. The pagan personification of the seasons and the earth, the sun, and the rivers were also recurring. Two interesting examples are the images of the summer and the goddess Ge, the earth, respectively represented in the month mosaics of Avatsai near Beirut and the Maret and Noman near Antioch in Syria, which decorated two Han-Or Syrian churches. The two personifications that were surrounded by the allegories of months Xanthikos and Hyperberetaios, the 2 months of the Syro-Macedonian calendar corresponding to April and October, alluded to fertility of the earth and its fruits that God has given to mankind for his sustenance, as written in the Psalm and in the 9th homily on Genesis by John Chrysostom. The pagan personification of the sun, holding the raised crown and surrounded by allegories of the 12 months, represented with the moon in the center of the calendar mosaic of the monastery of Lady Mary in Bethshan, became the symbol of Christ and the 12 apostles, as written by Zenon, Bishop of Verona, in his Tractatus, and by Maximus, Bishop of Turin, in his homily. Also, the image of the 4 rivers of paradise is derived by the pagan iconography, but acquired a Christian theological meaning. The rivers, Gihon and Pison, generally associated with Nile and Ganges, and Tigris and Euphrates, flowed from a single river of Eden, according to Genesis, or came from a paradise spring, ran through the ocean, and escaped to the earth, according to Ephraim the Syrian and Cosmas Indicopleustes. The images of the paradisiacal rivers had a very important meaning in the calendar mosaic of the Bishop Tirsos Basilica in Tegea, because according to the world map of Cosmas, in his Christian topography, the image of the months of the main nave, surrounded by those of marine creatures, symbolizes the earth at the center of the ocean, while the ornamentation of apse alluded to the Eden. The strategic role played by the main nave was fundamental for the church's plan and its decoration, because it contained the dedicatory inscription of the patron and represented the higher route that the faithful should have to travel to the altar placed in the church, generally paved with a floor mosaic representing the paradise. For this reason, like the pagan illustrated calendars, ornamented generally the OH and the triclinia, symbolically the most relevant room of the aristocratic houses. The Christian ones decorated primarily the central nave, as demonstrated by the already mentioned example of the Tirsos Basilica, but also those ones in Jordan, the St. Sophia's Church, the Southwest Funerary Chapel of the Jewish Cathedral, of the St. John the Baptist Church in Riab near Jerash, and the St. Cosmas and Damianus Church in Kerbert and Daria near Pella. In conclusion, the use of the month's image in the church, as well as that of antique and rural relations, the personifications of the sun, the moon, the 4 seasons, and the winds, confirms that the continuity of the pagan iconography in the Christian illustrated calendars, commissioned by elite patrons whose cultural background was based on the biblical texts and the furthest church theological works, but also on the classical high-level education. In the pagan context, the illustrated calendars, especially the rural ones, represented the visualization of the idea of the commissioner's worth, which was inspired by the imperial propaganda of the Felicitas Temporum, the prosperity of the times. In the Christian context, the calendar mosaics often associated with the images of seasonal labors and the natural creatures expresses the same idea of eternity, but symbolized the role of the mankind that enjoyed continuously the richness of the divine creation, as noted in Genesis 1:28, and consequently that of God, the creator of the cosmos and the time. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Parado, for a wonderful paper, this wonderful kind of journey through late antiquity and around the Mediterranean cultural zone. You can stop sharing your screen, and I think the format...
Yes.
The format
one moment, please.
The format we're operating with is that we'll have the papers first and the questions afterwards. So if you could just hold on to your questions, keep a note of them, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end of this session. So our next speaker I'm privileged to introduce is Dr. Aurélie Blanc, who joins us today from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, where she is affiliated, I believe, with the Department of English there. Aurélie is speaking to us today on the topic of a theatrical Easter ? Elevatio and Visitatio Sepulchri ceremonies and their drama-like features. So over to you, Dr. Blanc.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here with you all today and also to hear all of your papers. Let me share my screen. Okay. Is this working? Hopefully. Can you see this? Yes, great, wonderful. Good. In this paper, I will discuss two kinds of ceremonies, often called in scholarly literature the Elevatio and Visitatio Sepulchri, which were performed in European nunneries, monasteries, and cathedrals from about the 10th until the 16th century. So that would be monasteries from what is today Italy, Spain. We have some from Poland, England, and also France, Germany as well. They were performed by clerics, monks, and nuns, generally on Easter Day, as part of the Easter liturgy, at times in front of a lay congregation. To give you an idea of the content of these ceremonies, I will begin with a brief presentation of the Barking Abbey, Elevatio, and Visitatio. These are from the early 15th century, and while all of the ceremonies, or at least most of them, they're different from each other, they all share a general pattern. So we're using Barking as our example. According to the house's ordinal and customary, the nuns and clergy of Barking Abbey, as well as a lay congregation, were all in the Barking Abbey church on Easter morning for the office of matins. After the third responsory, the abbess began the Elevatio. She guided the nuns and a group of priests and clerics to the Mary Magdalene Chapel, where they represented the souls of patriarchs and prophets waiting for their deliverance during the harrowing of hell. You can see here a model and also a plan of the Abbey Church of Barking. And the Mary Magdalene Chapel might be one of the little side chapels visible on the plan. The officiating priest representing Jesus then walked towards that chapel, accompanied by priests and clerics. He knocked 3 times on the door opened, and all processed to a sepulchre from which the officiating priest took the host. Here are some pictures to illustrate my little description. They're taken from a performance we did of the ceremonies in 2018. So the priest took the host out of the sepulchre, he displayed it to the congregation and led the procession towards the altar of the Holy Trinity. His actions around the sepulchre symbolized the resurrection of the Lord. Then the Visitatio started as three nuns changed into white surplices and veils in the Mary Magdalene Chapel. Their abbess absolved them, and the three sisters started singing the laments of the three Marys. Carrying boxes of ointments to anoint the body of Christ, they walked towards the sepulchre, where they met two clerics wearing white stoles representing angels who told them of Christ's resurrection. The Marys kissed the place where Jesus had been laid. Jesus, probably played by a priest, then appeared from behind the altar, first to Mary Magdalene and later to all three Marys. The Marys kissed his feet before announcing the resurrection to the congregation, echoed by the other nuns. Priests and clerics representing the disciples then came towards the Marys. We have one disciple here, and they asked them what had happened. Mary Magdalene answered, the disciples rejoiced, and all of the participants, including the rest of the nuns and clergy, then proclaimed the resurrection. All right. You may have noticed that these ceremonies are a little bit odd, a little bit unusual, and they clearly seem liturgical. They are part of longer liturgical ceremonies. They are written in liturgical manuscripts. They're usually performed with liturgical objects, clothes, music, and yet they also possess theatrical features. We can mention the use of movements, of dialogue in Latin and sung, but still, of props, in inverted commas, such as the silver vessel standing in for the boxes of ointments, sorts of sets like the sepulchre. We have costumes like the stoles worn by the angels, and the expression of emotion. So the Marys must lament and then rejoice. And these are all used to publicly tell the story of the harrowing of hell, the resurrection, and the visit of the three Marys at the tomb of Christ. There have therefore been lengthy debates as to their nature. Should they be called drama or not? I will not spend too much time on this in this paper. It would require a lot more time than I have. While I will use words related to drama, like props, for example, because they quickly convey a specific meaning to a modern audience, I use them in inverted commas always to avoid confusion. Whether Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies should be categorized as drama or not, they do look more like plays than most of liturgy does, and as such, they stand out. So I'm interested in the reasons behind this. Why add drama-like features to the liturgy? What is the point? How was theatre perceived as useful in such a liturgical context? I will attempt to answer these questions through an analysis of various Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies. Keeping in mind Easter as the larger theme of this conference, I have chosen to confine my discussion to the ceremonies' drama-like features relevant to this feast. The first and second section, in those I will examine the ways in which these drama-like features help tell and teach the story of the resurrection and of its ties to Easter Day. And then the third and fourth sections will consider the ceremony's ability to draw attention to the importance of this story for those watching and participating in them. The first thing that Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies taught their spectators and participants about Easter was the scriptural story of the resurrection of Christ. The story, of course, is central to the feast, and it would have been referenced elsewhere in the day's liturgy. Yet, Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies, with their drama-like features, may have helped spectators and participants better understand the events celebrated on Easter Day. The first of these features helping tell the story of the resurrection is the ceremony's use of characters. The rubrics do not usually or tend not to refer to the performers singing chants, as is usually the case in liturgical manuscripts, but to their characters, the figures that they represent. So I've given you a few examples on the slide. Participants would therefore have had little doubt as to which figure they were representing. While there is some flexibility in this representation, the roles played by performers tend to be more clearly indicated and more stable in these ceremonies than in most medieval liturgy. Characters were also visually identifiable. When taking on a role in these type of ceremonies, performers wore specific clothing, although such clothing was often liturgical. Costumes. A few examples here. Monks and clerics representing the Marys, they are regularly described with amices or humal veils on their heads, probably to signify that they are women with veils. When women represented the Marys, they were dressed in altered versions of their habits and or in other liturgical clothing. At Gernrode, for example, they wore wimples and veils with red crosses. White was also worn it was worn at Troyes, Wilton, and Origny, and the color suggests the purity of the holy women. Both male and female Marys carried boxes and censers to represent the ointments that they brought to Christ's tomb. Angels were regularly dressed in white, in a white dalmatic at Rheinau, for example, as they were also in the Gospels. Such costumes thus recall the descriptions of these figures in scriptures, their depiction in medieval art, and they symbolically express some of their characteristics, like the purity of the Marys. The unusual use of some of these clothes may furthermore have drawn attention to the fact that the men and women religious wearing them were representing someone other than themselves. These recognizable figures interacted with each other during performances. Their movements indicated their relationships with each other. The women, for example, kneeling or prostrating themselves in front of Christ showed their respect for him, as well as the difference in their status. Or the way in which the three Marys moved and sang together was a clear sign that they formed one group. Movements in connection with the sepulchre were especially helpful in presenting an understandable narrative. Medieval sepulchres could be temporary, semi-temporary, or permanent features in churches. They were at times built on tombs, and their size and use varied. If a sepulchre was temporary or semi-temporary, it would have drawn the attention of spectators familiar with the usual layout of a church, just as the unusual costumes and props had. This piece of set was moreover central to the story told by the two ceremonies. The officiating priest, the Marys, and the angels' interactions with the sepulchre illustrated the main points of the scriptural story. The priest taking a host or sometimes a cross out of the sepulchre symbolized the resurrection. The Marys kissing the sepulchre showed their distress as well as their respect and love for Christ. The angels, and at times Mary Magdalene, pointing towards the sepulchre, visually expressed their claims that Christ was no longer in his tomb, but had risen. If this sepulchre was built on a tomb, its use in the ceremonies would have clearly communicated to spectators and participants that the story they told revolved around death and victory over death. And if it was not recognizably a tomb, the interactions of recognizable characters with the sepulchre helped explain its function in the ceremonies. Not only were performers meant to use gestures and movements, but they were also instructed by rubrics to express emotions. Such emotions continue to facilitate the comprehension of the scriptural narrative presented by elevatio and visitatio ceremonies. So even without understanding the words spoken by the performers, spectators could witness the change from grief to exuberant joy that the characters went through. If spectators were even vaguely familiar with the resurrection, they would therefore have been cued through textual, visual, and oral references to scriptures, to iconography, and to symbolic objects to recognize that this was the story told by the two ceremonies. The elevatio and visitatio thus acted as a reminder of this scriptural story. In the perhaps less likely case of spectators being unfamiliar with the story, they would have been presented with a linear narrative with clear turning points, relationships between its characters, and emotional beats. This would have at least encouraged their understanding of the day's celebrations. Because of their drama-like features, the two ceremonies therefore presented the story of the resurrection in a clearer way than most liturgy could. And they also tied this specific story to Easter, showing their spectators and participants that these events were the ones celebrated on that day. As expressed earlier, elevatio and visitatio ceremonies were part of longer liturgical services, and they took place in the same space as these and the rest of the day's liturgy. They featured some of the same objects, same clothes, performers, and they also shared chants with other Easter liturgical services. Elevatio and visitatio ceremonies include extracts from the Gospels, which would have been read on or around Easter Day. I've given you examples from Barking again on the slide. And the rest of the dialogues is often composed of at least some Easter liturgical chants, like the Victimae Paschali Laudes, for instance. Spectators and participants in the two drama-like ceremonies would therefore have heard these chants in the context of the narrative of the resurrection. Hearing them again during other Easter liturgical ceremonies would have tied that narrative to these ceremonies, revealing how fundamental this narrative was for the feast day in general. This story was significant for the celebration of Easter, but it was also essential in their own lives. The death and resurrection of Christ were the reason they now had a chance to be saved. Christ had died for humankind, for them. Elevatio and visitatio ceremonies emphasize this connection between the story that they tell and the people present at their performance. Their drama-like features enable them to include these people in this story, for performers, this inclusion was done using the familiar props and costumes detailed earlier. The performance, moreover, took place in their church. It featured people that they knew, a type of music that they sang every day. Here was a scriptural story told through means that were part of their daily lives. Performers also physically and actively took part in the scriptural story that they told, kneeling in front of Christ, for example, moving towards the sepulchre. It is difficult to know exactly how they would have felt, of course, when performing. Even in the case of modern performers, their feelings change from performance to performance and performer to performer. I do not mean to suggest either that medieval men and women religious believed themselves present at the resurrection because they were involved in its performance. However, performing the visitatio and elevatio may have facilitated a connection between them and the events that they were portraying through their own bodies and with their own clothes, object, music, and space. For spectators who did not perform in elevatio and visitatio ceremonies, this feeling of connection with and inclusion in scriptural events may still have occurred. Some of the ceremonies, like those of Barking, require their performers to turn and sing towards the congregation. And this usually took place in the Elevatio after the resurrection and in the Visitatio after the acknowledgement of the resurrection. So this significant event was thus announced to the laity, emphasizing its importance for them as well. At times, as you can see with the example of Nuremberg, lay spectators even answered with a song. They could therefore be included in the representation of this scriptural story. The liturgical objects, clothes, and music used to tell the story, as well as the churches in which it was performed, were probably less familiar to the lay spectators as they were to the ceremony's participants. However, the medieval laity did attend services in monastic and cathedral churches, and they could even be buried there in exchange for a substantial donation. Performing the Elevatio and Visitatio in these spaces would thus have included the dead and their families in the ceremonies. Smaller lay donations, such as images and sculptures, as well as two types of objects essential to the performance of Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies, the sepulchre and candles, may also have been visible to the spectators of and participants in drama-like ceremonies. As mentioned earlier, the sepulchre was central to this performance, and candles could be held by those representing the souls freed by Christ during the harrowing of hell, or by and around the Marys. Such objects involved their donors in the scriptural scenes performed. It was their candles that the Marys were carrying, their sepulchre that the host, Christ, was taken out of. The sepulchre is an object intimately tied with death. At times, it was even built on a donor's tomb. Candles, too, could evoke death. Those provided by guilds were often burnt at the funeral of their members. Yet both sepulchre and candles also signified the hope of the resurrection. Christ had risen out of his sepulchre, and he and his victory over death were associated with the triumph of light over darkness. The contribution by lay people to the performance of drama-like ceremonies thus associated them not only with the scriptural story that the ceremonies depicted, but also with some of the themes essential to Easter. It helped them realize that the death and resurrection of Christ, discussed and shown in the ceremonies, concerned them too. This death and resurrection were tied to their own death and to their own afterlife. I'm running out of time, so we'll skip the next part and move towards the end of the paper. Elevatio and Visitatio ceremonies therefore seem to have been useful tools to keep spectators and participants on a virtuous and pious path on Easter Day. Through their drama-like features, they served as means of informing and reminding their spectators and participants of the scriptural story of the resurrection, as means of making them realize the connection between this story and Easter, as means of relating this story to their own lives and afterlives, and because of that, as means of encouraging them to take action to ensure their salvation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for this paper, Aurélie. Bien joué. Very well done. We'll continue now with the remaining paper in the session. Our next speaker for the segment is Dr. Alessia Brombin, who joins us today from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in beautiful Rome, the Eternal City. Dr. Brombin's paper today is entitled Lazarus Saturday and Chrysostom's Teachings, Reflections on Resurrection and Faith. So over to you, Dr. Brombin.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to participate. I'm grateful for this chance to share my insight at this conference. I share my power presentation. Let's go. The feast, which commemorates the resurrection of Lazarus, finds its raison d'être, as can be easily inferred in the biblical passage narrating this episode, namely in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, from the first verse to 44 verse, and the chapter 11. Where Lazarus is specifically mentioned twice as the one who he had raised from the dead. There are at least 3 ancient Greek homilies as listed in the Corpus Christianorum, entirely devoted to the commentary of resurrection of this biblical figure. For the majority of them, namely 13 homilies, authorship has been attributed to John Chrysostom. Although the textual criticism today has partly reassignated them to pseudo-Chrysostomic production. Some have not yet been published in print and are only found in ancient manuscripts, where others bear the condemnation of false attribution, such as the 3 homilies on Lazarus, as well the homily on Martha and Mary and Lazarus, while in Quadriarum Lazarum has been accepted as authentic. It was actually included in the Nitris contra Anomeus as the 9th homily. It is suggested that Chrysostom took advantage of the Gospel of the day to resume the discussion with Anomeus on the equality of the Father and the Son. This homily, dated by Paul Hawkins to 387, is also supported by Malingre. Furthermore, Goldenmouth commented on this biblical passage in the homilies on John, and to a limited extent in the homily on Matthew. But this analysis will focus on in Quadriarum Lazarum, Lazarus dead from 4 days in English. The homily was delivered on the Saturday before Palm Sunday of 387, or alternately a few weeks after Easter, and the same here. Most likely coinciding with the liturgical memorial of Lazarus Sunday. However, the backdrop against which the words of the renewed Antiochian preacher stand is dogmatic heresiological. As even in the occasion, he did not hesitate to take a stance against the Anomeus, albeit without explicitly naming them. He begins by stating that the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead allows us to counter some objection raised by the heretics regarding the likeness between the Father and the Son. who argue that Jesus needed to pray to the Father in order to raise Lazarus, that we can see in this slide in the original text. Chrysostom declared his thoughts from the outset. I quote, "Everything Christ did in raising Lazarus was done because of the weakness of the Jews who are present, and I shall prove this as my discourse move forward." End of quotation. The method proposed to resolve this issue was to address main objections regarding the alleged dependence of the Son's actions on the will of the Father, so as to refute them point by point with the help of the sacred scripture. The first objection questioned the omniscience of Jesus, as she did not know the exact location of Lazarus and had to pray to the Father for the miracle to occur. The encouragement proposed and strongly advocated through the homily is encapsulated in this statement by John Chrysostom. I quote a few words from this homily. "But the argument is really a blasphemy because they do not understand that Christ prayed by way of a condescension and accommodation to the weakness of those who are present." End of quotation. The homily is aimed at bolstering the faith of the listeners and understanding what the resurrection entails. For this reason, the biblical text highlights the progressive attempts of the announcement. First, among those close to Jesus, namely the disciples, Martha and Mary, and then the evangelists attempted to make the Jews understand what was being discussed. The apostles themselves initially did not comprehend Jesus' cryptic way of speaking. I refer to John in the middle of this chapter, in chapter 11, but eventually consented to go with him to Bethany. They later understood the difference between Lazarus' lips and a resurrection. Upon arriving at Bethany, they found Martha of Lazarus' sisters, who instantly reproached Jesus for his delayed arrival in the city. Chrysostom argues that this was due to her weakness in faith, because, I quote, "At the moment Martha did not know that even if Christ were not bodily on the spot, he was present through the power of his divinity, but she was measuring the teacher's power by his bodily presence." End of quotation. The Greek language is more explicit in its numerous nuance, as the text highlights a distinction between the term exousia and dunamis, which are two qualities common to the manifestation of the divinity, namely authority and power. And Jesus' authority is exercised everywhere and at all times, even at a distance. The dynamis emphasizes the exercise of this authority on its part. Hence, the powers of dynamis adds in Greek, we have the verb pimetry, and in a way offers the measure. The primary meaning of these verbs is sovereignty. For Chrysostom, the fact that Jesus prayed is highly revealing of the divine condescension toward man. I quote, "For God has no need of prayer to raise a dead man to life," end of quotation. In Martha's request lies the invocation of Jesus to the Father, which, according to Chrysostom, serves as a full proof that, I quote, "But it was not because he had need to pray. It was because we have accommodating himself through her weakness. He was showing her that he was not opposite to God, but whatever he does, the Father also does," end of quotation. Martha's request is granted due to the supreme authority of both the Father and the Son, which is an integral part of the divine pedagogy. In the homily, the Antiochian preacher completes a list of perplexities that could arise in the minds of the human unaccustomed to signs of this kind and to understanding the joint actions of the Father and the Son. For example, someone might indeed think that as a result of the supplication to God, the miracle has occurred. Jesus indeed performed this sign to reveal the power of God. That is, the authority assured by the divine person by virtue of their mutual equality. The reason for this lies in these words that I quote, "What happened then was not a sign or wonder, but a lesson and instruction for those who are standing." Kategetes, there is in the original Greek that I show on this slide. Divine pedagogy is expressed through catechesis to the multitude of Jesus gathered near the homes. As Jesus aims for a mystagogical action regarding the prefiguration of his resurrection. The second reference to the authority, when we speak about authority, we speak about exousia in the original Greek. The authority of Jesus and the Father found in the homily aims to emphasize the extension of authority to both death and life, but above all, it traces this authority back to the ability to appeal to God as his Father. For this reason, he also raised Lazarus from the dead. The manifestation of his authority to the crowd is aiming at instructing them, that is catechizing them, because Chrysostom used catechetes instead, in Greek, didache. As he does not present himself as a teacher who parts a lesson without considering he is a student, but as a son who reveals the mystery of the resurrection through a concrete action in harmony with the will of the Father. For this reason, Chrysostom believes that the words of the gospel can be said otherwise. I quote, "Look, by my authority I summon the dead man. By my own power I command dead. I call the Father, Father. I call Lazarus forth from the tomb." End of quotation. It is worth nothing the use of the pronoun emes to indicate the power is of Christ. Why, when referring to exousia, he used oikeos, which means own or personal, which could suggest the common authority shared by the Father and the Son. This is the same power in Greek autentia that exercised in the case of God thief, as also mentioned in this homily. I quote, "But by his own authority Christ opened paradise and fought in thief." This power, otherwise called authority in English translation, recurs twice in the homily, and it is always in the reference to Christ, while exousia is used 3 times in this homily, the last of which is in the concluding lines, which are worth quoting in full. But he commanded the Jews to undo the bandage with which they had bound Lazarus when they placed him in the tomb. He did this so that they might recognize the marks of the very bonds which they had put on him. He did this so that by their own experience they might learn from the very things which they themselves had done, that this is the same Lazarus whom they had placed in the tomb. Also wished them to learn that he is the Christ who, according to the gracious purpose of the Father, came into the world and who had power over life and death. End of quotation. Finally, although briefly touched upon, we have had the opportunity to understand that God and Jesus possess the same authority over life and death. Furthermore, we have observed that the pair dynamis and exousia has allowed us to reflect on Jesus' existence of this divine power as an expression of the shared authority with the Father. Through the combination of Authentia and Exousia, we have inferred that Jesus himself is the one who performs signs or miracle concretely by virtue of this authority, revealing the anonymous with the will of the Father and the Son, the same authority that raised Christ from the dead. The homily also presents itself as an explicit statement of Jesus' catechetical intention, as a prelude to the mystery of his death and the resurrection, with the would soon occur. Thank you for your attention. Ευχαριστώ a te, Prazuki.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Brombeen, for a wonderful paper. The session overall had a wonderful kind of thread of continuity. We learned from Dr. Parado about church architecture, and then we heard from Dr. Blanc about the uses of these liturgical spaces, their primary function as venues for the performance of the liturgy, and now having heard from Dr. Brombeen the theological underpinnings of these buildings and their uses. So thank you to all our speakers for this wonderful panel. I'll open the floor to questions from participants. If anybody has any questions, please indicate by raising your hand or unmuting yourself.
Hello, John. All right. I have a question about the calendar, the months mosaics, which of course is a very interesting and very important phenomenon. I wonder how would you characterize, in a sense, the Christianization of this very widespread motif, which obviously has great antiquity. And so in addition to sort of claiming, power, dominion, and so forth, taking into account that the zodiac appears in a variety of contexts, how do you propose to understand the phenomenon of both Christianizing the months and Judaizing the months? Because you have it also in a Jewish context. What do you think about this development?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for this question. Effectively, there are two different interpretations about the Christian use of the iconography of time and the zodiac in the Christian building, in the Christian church or church, and the use of the same iconographic patterns in the, for example, in a Judaism cultural context. Because, for example, the images of zodiac in the church buildings generally are connected with the Jewish calendar. But in the Christian church, the use of zodiac has a different meaning because usually it is connected with more specific meaning. The power of God in all the universe, all the cosmos, included the time. So the Christian patrons use the zodiac iconography, but naturally they don't have a specific idea of the ancient meaning of zodiac, but they used this image with a new semantic use. And naturally, there is a very big difference between the Christian religion and the pagan religion, and their study of astrology and so much.
Thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
Dr. Pardo as well, if I might use my privilege as the chair. And this becomes a really big phenomenon in the medieval period, where we have this concept called the labors of the month, labor in terms of working, where I think it kind of evolves into more a concept of agriculture, where you have
Yes.
foundations. I was struck in your presentation by quite how pagan some of the images looked with the little moon and star. It's almost like this kind of symbology that we see by neo-pagans today. The kind of
Yes.
arrow and so forth. Great. Further questions for our speakers? Hagith?
Well, I was actually quite struck by the reenactment of Easter rituals in a relatively modern context. And the strangest thing, I was just reading a chapter about the Holy Week in Sevilla, which happened only 40 years ago, and it's described in a travel book because it was such it was such a there was, perhaps still is, such a remarkable enactment of every single aspect. But the way it's done in Seville from already like the 13th century is you can see how it reintegrates the city. This is the one week in which the entire city, all the classes, all the people there, all the genders and so forth are truly become integrated through this continuous entire week ceremony, in which probably half the city participates and half the city observes, plus God knows how many tourists. So it's for me, the rituals that you describe appear very stylized. And I was wondering, when did they acquire this very stylized feature, in a sense, nearly a summary rather than expansion of the events on the Holy Week? It nearly looks like an abstract, like taking certain features and trying to ritualize them in a different way. So I was very curious whether these represent an expansion or retraction, or what aspect of the Holy Week do these rituals particularly signify or express?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the explanation, Bill. That sounds really interesting for me. So these types of ceremonies, they start. They're sort of they seem to kind of expand a bit until about the 12th century. So the first ones tend to be a little bit shorter. The appearance of Christ at the end, that doesn't necessarily happen. So you have some where it's only the three Marys, the angels, and then proclamation of the resurrection, and that's it. And then around the 12th century, then they become a bit longer. Some of them have more time with the disciples, the apostles at the end, and things like that. But you're right, it's mostly these events. So usually there aren't other episodes added onto that. There are other types of play ceremonies, like some of them about the shepherds. There's in some churches they did something around Christmas as well, which are sort of people debating over how much, how liturgical are they, how integrated are they in liturgy. These are very clearly part of the liturgy, usually of the Easter Matins liturgy. Yes, but there are also other ceremonies during Holy Week that are sort of a little bit more performative or theatrical maybe than a lot of liturgy, with things like the procession on Palm Sunday already, if we want to go back a bit. Some of the processions you have in some churches or monasteries. I'm sure today as well in some places, but in the ones from England that I looked at, where we've got someone representing, symbolizing Caiaphas and having a dialogue with another character or things like that. I don't know if I've answered exactly.
I was sort of wondering, in a sense, we tend to talk about performance so much. So I was actually wondering about the relationship between performance and audiences. Can we actually reconstruct what may have? I mean, because one of the comment that the most interesting comment for me in that account of the Holy Week in Seville about 40 years ago was that chap says, I was wondering what goes through the minds of those who behold us, sweating, carrying the cross, or me really looking out of place or something like that. So I'm sort of wondering if we can actually reconstruct or reflect or speculate about the relationship between performance and audience during a Holy Week, which essentially is ritual. It's not just Holy Week; it's actually ritual.
Yes, it's a very good question. It's very difficult, I think, because even if you study performance today, if you have interviews with actors after one performance of the same play, and then you have the same interview after performance of the same, another performance, they will have different impressions. People in the audience who all watch the same play might have liked it or not, or have liked this bit. It depends on sight lines and where you sit and who you are. So it's really difficult to do, to really generalize. I think what we can look at is sort of what the text wants to do or tries to do or presents, but then did people really react to that or not? These ceremonies seem to have been popular. There's a lot of them, and so I was intrigued as to why would one want to put those sort of theatrical things in the liturgy, and what would the reasons be? But it is speculative because ultimately we don't know. Yeah. Yes, we did some performances of them and interviewed the actors afterwards to have a kind of modern take on that, and maybe learn some things from that, and you have new questions, new things come up. We talked to some nuns who watched the show as well, but they're not medieval nuns, and yeah, so it's
no, the medieval nuns would be difficult to interview, but you can try a little bit more contemporary nuns, and particularly those who speak English, so you don't have to improve on your Russian. And you can try and get that. Yeah, which, by the way, the same thing about Chrysostom. I mean, he was obviously a master of rhetoric, and one always wonders, some of his sermons, literally, you can see him trying to get the audience to just, okay, go do something. And I was sort of wondering about your take on the, in a sense, on the purpose of all these on all these speculations about Easter and of course Lazarus and so forth, which would have been familiar to audiences. So how was he trying to, in a sense, activate his audience in the direction that he wanted them to be activated? I don't know what happened to the Chrysostom expert.
Yeah, the purpose of Chrysostom is to combat the heretical Anomeus. This homily was delivered extra tempore. There was not an audience in front of Chrysostom. This is the problem. This is a problem with this homily. I prefer to analyze this homily instead the easier on Gospel of John, while I am interested to explain the authorship of this homily. This is a critical problem. My research is not finished with this. I want to compare the text of 64, homily on John, the Gospel of John. There is some in common with this background, heretical background. This group of homily was delivered in the same year. It's not possible to not find connection.
Yes, I agree. And we are looking forward to your continuing the research and publishing the results. It's extremely interesting. Actually, what you write in your study and what you deliver in the church.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And further questions for our participants?
John, I've been asked to end the question and answer panel because we're way out of time. So unfortunately, no more questions.
Okay, well, it remains just to thank our speakers. Thank you very much. So over to Zoe and Hagit for the concluding remarks.
Zoe.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to realize the success of this conference. All the speakers and the presentations were wonderful, interesting, and of high quality. I just want to thank you, and I hope to see you again at another event.
And hopefully the next event will be with real coffee and real Greek delicacies.
We hope so too.
Yes. I have checked Greek delicacies. They are wonderful.
Great.
I was in Athens last December and I loved it. But I haven't been to Crete, and I think we can all vote. Would we like to have a next conference in Crete?
Of course, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's great. I guess we can end now this conference. Thank you very much. Hagit, would you like to say anything further?
I would just like to say that, every time we meet in this informal way, I feel so humbled. There is so much wonderful research out there. There are so many interesting, really fascinating things, and it opens so many doors for my own research. Even when it's not directly connected to what everybody's doing, it's so inspiring. So I'm very grateful to everyone. Thank you so much. And Zoe, you are as amazing as ever.
Thank you very much. We all are.
All the very best. I am going now to the demonstration. So this is the weekly demonstration in Tel Aviv, which is trying to get the government to resign. So you need to wish us good luck.
Of course, good luck.
Yeah, I know. We've tried a long time. All right. So I'm going. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.